So first of all, I want to thank the conference organizers for including this paper into the program. I think this paper is a almost the very appropriate paper for this workshop series, given that there's two things in this paper that is going to be very much kind of very much in this space of disclosure and trade secrecy. So this paper is titled Reverse Engineering Innovation. This paper is co-authored with Travis Dyer, who's at BYU. And pretty much in this paper, what we are going to be focusing on is going to be thinking about what is this idea of reverse engineering and how are we going to measure it? And then we're going to study an economic research question regarding this phenomenon. So we're going to go ahead and first define what we mean by reverse engineering. And there's many definitions out there in terms of how to kind of measure how to define this. But what we're going to be looking at is the fact that this is a phenomenon where competitors are purchasing your product, they're taking it apart and studying every element in order to copy these competitors' products. And this is actually perceived by companies as one of the most effective methods for learning about competitors' products. So we actually also view this activity as a almost like a information acquisition strategy, especially regarding understanding your competitors' products. And to kind of give you an example, what we're kind of studying in this whole big concept of reverse engineering, there's one example that we want to kind of mention here, which is related to this General Motors teardown lab. So you can see in this example that you have these car companies basically kind of tearing apart their competitors' cars in order to kind of understand the specific innovation procedures that their competitors are going through. So this is kind of the fact that we kind of see this type of stuff happen a lot in anecdotal evidence, but we have really not a lot of evidence regarding how this actually happens. How can we even kind of identify this in the data? So that brings us to our key research question. We're going to study how competitors' trade secrecy shapes these types of reverse engineering activities. So in terms of constructs and measurement, so I want to kind of lay out the big picture here. What we're trying to do is we're studying how peers' trade secrecy affects these types of reverse engineering activities. And the innovation in terms of measuring reverse engineering, I'll get to it later. But in order to first get at trade secrecy, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be relying on the 10K text. Basically, we're going to be identifying companies that have mentioned trade secrecy in their 10K text, and we're going to be kind of inferring that as these companies using trade secrecy for their innovation procedures. Now, if we're going to focus on the Y variable here, which is reverse engineering, this is where we kind of innovate this in the sense that we're going to be measuring this reverse engineering activity by looking at the abnormal product purchasing patterns around these company headquarters. And we're going to be using this very granular Nielsen scanner data, which kind of tracks these product purchases in a very wide scale. And before I go forward, I kind of want to clarify some terminology. I'm going to be referring to a lot of these, the firms that have trade secrecy as those companies that have that are targeted by this type of activity, whereas the companies that are doing reverse engineering I'm going to be referring to them as the targeting companies, the ones that are trying to copy the targeted firms. So the previous findings, before I kind of lose my way into these empirical results, we first want to really get construct validity out there in the first place. Is this abnormal pure product purchases around these company headquarters? Are they really associated with things that you potentially see with reverse engineering activities? So we're going to show you that this novel measure is correlated with things like product similarity, technological similarity with competitors, and we also will show you that this kind of correlates also with R&D activities and also patenting behavior of those companies that are doing this type of activities. We're also going to show you that this pure product purchases is also correlated with lower gross margins for those competitors that are targeted by this type of activities. And we're also going to lastly show you that these abnormal product purchases are spiking just before these types of companies introduce new products. And then moving on, after establishing this construct validity, our main results show you that reverse engineering is positively related to the level of competitors' trade secrecy. And this is robust to the usage of this DTSA, the Defend Trade Secrets Act, as a shock to increased level of trade secrecy. And then we're going to show you some cross-sectional variation that demonstrate that this result is stronger when there's a lot of product market competition, when product market competition intensifies due to tariff shocks, but also at the same time, this relation is weaker, is stronger when hiring these competitor employees is much more difficult due to uh, institutional constraints. And then we're going to show you some interesting patterns that show up when we look at the life cycle stages of the companies that are doing this behavior and also the ones that are being targeted by this behavior. So in terms of economic predictions, what we kind of want to get out there in the first place is that this relationship between competitors' trade secrecy and reverse engineering is not ex ante obvious. And there's two ways this can happen. We predict that there may be a positive relationship where trade secrecy actually increases reverse engineering. And this can happen for several reasons, but the key reasons that I want to emphasize is that these trade secrets have weaker legal protection for those companies that are engaging in this type of activity, which basically means that these copycat firms would have a very high benefit if they actually target these types of companies that have trade secrets. And also at the same time, we also argue that these trade secrets potentially provide less information about companies' innovation. As we kind of seen in if a company is pursuing trade secrets, they typically are not going to be disclosing their innovation through patent filings, meaning that these copycats will now have to find alternative ways to kind of understand competitors' innovations. So we think that there may be a more increased incentive for these companies to reverse engineer pure products. At the same time, we also think that the trade secrecy would also potentially negatively affect reverse engineering. And why is that? Because if companies are engaging in trade secrecy, this also potentially means there's less information about about those companies' innovations, which implies that there are much higher costs for the copycat to engage in this type of behavior. It also implies that trade secrecy is associated with lower awareness of companies' innovation, of those peers' innovations, which means that it may deter follow-on innovation by copycats in the form of reverse engineering. So overall, these economic predictions suggest that this relationship between competitors' trade secrecy and reverse engineering, not ex ante obvious, and we're going to take this research question to the data. So this is a part where I want to kind of go through how we're going to measure reverse engineering. And there's a two-step procedure that we kind of use here. First, we have to identify what we mean by peer group. And when we define peer group, we're going to be using the text-based competitors that is very much well used by Holberg and Phillips methodology. So take, for example, here that we have some set of companies that we identify from the Nielsen scanner data. We have around 515 public firms, and we're able to see what type of products they're selling at a specific point in time during the sample period. So in this example, let's say there's McKesson, and for simplicity purposes, they have these 4 product modules that they're kind of selling products in, and we're going to be identifying all of those TNIC competitors that are available in Compustat. So one example here would be Cardinal Health. And we're going to be identifying their headquarter location for these competitor firms. And then what do? We're going to now sum up the product purchases that happen in that headquarters regarding those specific product modules that are being sold by these competitors. So we're going to just sum up the total purchasing volume of the products in those 4 modules to kind of understand whether this is a large or small amount of purchases. So we kind of take more steps in order to kind of show you that this is not just simply just market demand, for instance. So in order to do this, we're going to be kind of getting the abnormal amount of this product purchases after scaling by population, of course. So after scaling by population, the number of purchases, we're going to also take the abnormal amount of that scaled purchases that happen in that specific zip code relative to all other zip codes. So it's a very much measure that kind of already parses out a lot of this market demand related factors that could be driving these types of purchases. So overall, after doing these steps, we have around 3,500 unique firms in the sample, and we're able to track this type of abnormal purchasing behavior over almost 15 years from 2006 to 2020. So having measured this abnormal product purchases of specific headquarters of that kind of suggests reverse engineering activity, we really have to now nail down this construct validity. So how are we going to do this? We're going to do something called the duck test. So this is a very humorous way of putting this. It basically, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And of course, this test is not going to be perfect, but it suggests that our measure is behaving the way it should if it was actually proxying for reverse engineering activities. So let's compare this measure with things like future innovation and product market outcomes. We are also going to see how this relates to the gross margins of those companies that are exposed by this type of behavior. And also we're going to look at how this relates to product market entries. So the first test that we're going to do is related to just general innovation and product market related outcomes. So first, we are going to just regress this on a firm year level basis. And as you can see in this result, if you're moving from the bottom to the top decile of reverse engineering, that is associated with around 5% increase in terms of product technology similarities and also the number of patents filed. And there's a 12% increase in R&D expenses, suggesting that our measure does capture some of this innovation activity and potentially things that could affect the product markets of those companies that are engaging in this behavior. So first, it does show evidence that it walks like a duck. In the second test, we're now going to take a look at what happens to those companies that are exposed by this type of behavior. So we're going to just look at all the competitors that have a lot of this activity happening to them. And we show that if you're moving from the bottom to the top decile of reverse engineering, there's around 9% decrease in terms of these peer firm gross margins. And more importantly, this effect on the gross margins are entirely being driven by a change in sales growth, which suggests that these companies' market share is being eroded by this type of reverse engineering activity that competitors are engaging in. Whereas you don't see any effect in the change in cost of goods sold, suggesting that it's not really something about cost structure that is changing. So in the second evidence, we show that this measure is quacking like a duck. And then in the last third validation test, what we're going to be doing is we're going to identify product market entries, specifically when these companies enter into new product markets, specifically product markets that they've not actually been in. And we're going to try to see whether this type of abnormal peer product purchases are spiking just before these companies are entering into these product markets. And as you see in this figure, that is indeed the case where a lot of these peer product purchases are intensified leading up to that new product market entry. So this last evidence suggests that our measure is potentially capturing some level of reverse engineering activity, although with a little bit of noise, as we definitely have to caveat. Now turning into our main empirical specification, what we're going to be doing at a panel regression setting, we're going to be simply regressing this reverse engineering measure with the amount of the percentage of competitors that have trade secrecy. And again, how we measure this is simply the amount of text-based competitors that explicitly mention trade secrecy in their 10K during that period. And the control variables that we include are very standard. All these variables that are kind of correlated with potentially companies' innovation activities. And the key fixed effect structure is going to be at the firm and quarter level. Turning to the main result, what we show is that there is a significant statistical relationship between the amount of your competitors that engage in trade secrecy and how that affects these companies' reverse engineering activities. In terms of economic magnitude, what we're documenting here is if you're moving from the 25th to the 75th percentile, in terms of the pure trade secrecy measure, there's around 10% increase in this type of activity, suggesting that it is significant in the sense of economic magnitude. Now, importantly, we want to do a falsification test at this point to show you that if we change the way we measure the dependent variable, specifically by just aggregating products that are not related. Think about products that are simply just not going to be purchased by that competitor because they're not in the same business, they're not in the same industry. If we use those types of products and then just aggregate and use create the measure the same way and get the abnormal purchases of those types of products, we actually find nothing, suggesting that this finding that we're documenting in the main result is not simply just a change in market demand or local economic conditions. Now we turn the switch to looking at patenting. And why we're looking at patenting is motivated by the fact that this is kind of, in our sense, the inverse of trade secrecy. So as I've mentioned earlier, if a company is engaging in trade secrecy, that typically suggests that they're not patenting and there's not a lot of information about their innovations. So the flip side of that is that if companies are engaging in a lot of patenting activity, there's going to be a lot of information about their innovations that are already available on public. So we should be expecting a negative correlation when we measure the amount of competitors' patents with reverse engineering. And that's exactly what we find here, where reverse engineering is much less prevalent when these competitors make greater use of patents. And that third column right there is an interesting one because we're going to be measuring how vague patent disclosure looks like. And if patent disclosure is very vague, which suggests that competitors will have a hard time understanding the innovation that their competitors did, we see a positive relation with that amount and reverse engineering, suggesting that this actually more or less acts like trade secrecy in that sense. Now, at this point, we also want to emphasize that moving beyond the panel regression setting, we also use a pairwise specification. And the motivation for this using a pairwise specification is that this relation that we just showed you could be driven by confounding events at the industry level. So now we're going to exploit the variation within the industry, specifically identify within the industry companies that have trade secrecy versus those that do not have trade secrecy. And using this pairwise measure, we show results that look very similar to our main specification, where reverse engineering by firm I is much more pronounced when their competitor peer firm J relies on trade secrecy. And the reverse is true for the amount of patents that are filed. So that suggests some comfort in terms of our panel regression results. At this point, also, we want to mention that this relation between reverse engineering and trade secrecy is going to be definitely endogenous. You can think about the case that some companies that are potentially going to be more exposed to this type of behavior, they're not going to just sit there and just do what they're doing. They might potentially decide to pursue other types of innovation strategies. So in order to kind of address this endogenous relationship, we're going to be exploiting this quasi-exogenous variation from this Defend Trade Secrets Act. The DTSA, in more detail, was adopted in 2016, and this enhances federal protection for trade secrecy. So it's a more institutional level shock that allows companies to increase their trade secrecy activities. But at the same time, we also kind of acknowledge that this DTSA is not the only type of protection that companies had before this type of shock. Companies typically had some state level protection in terms of their trade secrecy using the UTSA. But this is very heterogeneous because there were some states, the affected states right here, that did not adopt UTSA at the time of this federal regulation. So we're going to be using those affected states as those places that would be showing a higher increase in trade secrecy. And the diff and diff design is going to be looking at 2 years and 2 years pre and post this shock. So first, we're going to validate the shock by showing you that indeed we see companies shifting towards trade secrecy, those companies that are headquartered in those affected states more or less after the DTSA is passed. And then using that validation, we're now going to test whether whether the amount of peers that are headquartered in those two states, whether those companies are going to be engaging in more reverse engineering in the post period. And we do find that is the case. And this economic magnitude is very similar to our main result, where there's around 10%, or in this case, 12% increase in the amount of reverse engineering activities. So we're now going to take a look at some interesting cross-sectional variation. The first cross-sectional variation that we want to kind of emphasize is this this level of competition. And this competition here refers to product market competition, where this increase in competition would lead to a rise in incentives for these companies to reverse engineer in order to kind of maintain the market position. So in order to kind of proxy for this competition, product market competition, we're going to be using tariff reductions. Specifically, we're going to be identifying significant tariff reductions where in an industry, there's going to be a huge decrease in tariff reductions that are not followed later on by corresponding increases. And we show that this finding basically between trade secrecy and reverse engineering is much more pronounced when there's a higher level of product market competition, suggesting that this is where the incentive really kicks in. The second cross-sectional variation that we want to emphasize is this labor market aspect, specifically whether companies can hire away their competitors' employees in order to do this type of behavior. And we're going to be exploiting another institutional level cross-sectional variation here using the inevitable disclosure doctrine. This basically increases restrictions on hiring rival employees, suggesting that companies that are headquartered in these states are going to have a larger incentive to reverse engineering using product market strategies such as the one that we're documenting in our paper. And in order to estimate this using our specification, we're going to simply use the above median indicator for the amount of competitors that have a large percentage of their peers headquartered in states that enforce this IDD. And we find that indeed, companies that are more exposed to this have higher restrictions on hiring rival employees. Those are the companies that are engaging in more reverse engineering when there's trade secrecy. And lastly, if we want to look at some of the interesting variations that are generated by the product life cycle. And by the product life cycle, we're talking about companies that are both targeted by reverse engineering, which in this case is peer firms, and the companies that are engaging in reverse engineering, the focal firm, the copycat firms that we're studying. So we see here in this in this regression, pretty much what we're going to be doing is measuring the different product life cycle stages using the 10K base measure by Hoberg and Maximovic. And we do show that a lot of the companies that are being targeted by reverse engineering are those that are in the very early stages of innovation. And this makes a lot of intuitive sense to us because these companies are the ones where there's going to be a lot of innovative new products that are being introduced to the market. Whereas the focal firms that are doing this behavior, the more interesting thing here is that companies that are in the decline stage are engaging in this type of behavior in the last row right there, suggesting that there's a lot of mature companies that are basically trying to try to leapfrog their early stage competitors by deciding to just copy these types of products by those early innovators, which we think is a very interesting pattern that we document in the data. We do a bunch of robustness. For time purposes, I want to just emphasize one measure here, which is related to the survey. which is going to be simply an industry level survey that kind of provides some level of comfort in terms of the fact that our measure of trade secrecy also survives when we use a more direct measure, which is a survey-based measure asking the companies whether they rely on trade secrecy. And the second thing that we want to emphasize in the robustness is this idea of reverse engineering that we kind of measure using the number of litigations. Basically, the number of litigations that suggest that a company has engaged in reverse engineering. And this is very much correlated with our main measure, although the percentage is pretty low. We still think that this is suggestive of the fact that our main measure is indeed capturing some amount of this actual activity that is happening. So in conclusion, what do? We study reverse engineering, which is we think that is an important yet underexplored innovation strategy that hasn't really been studied so far because there has always been this methodological issue in terms of how are we going to measure this activity. So in that sense, we are kind of the first one to kind of suggest that this is a way where you can actually measure this type of behavior, something that is happening using a big data. And I think that's going to be something that inspires a lot of more additional research in this area. And more importantly, at the more fundamental conceptual level, we kind of reevaluate this relation between disclosure and innovation. And what do we mean by this? Typically, the conventional view is that if companies are not disclosing their innovation, that potentially leads to less spillover for other companies. Therefore, there's going to be less follow-on innovation. But we kind of turn this around the head. Basically, what we find is that non-disclosure, which we are proxying using by trade secrecy, actually increases this activity, which we look at, which is this reverse engineering activity, suggesting that this relationship between innovation and disclosure is very much something that is more nuanced, suggesting that there may be a very different type of equilibrium that actually happens in practice. So that is all I have for these slides, and I definitely look forward to Will's excellent discussion. Thank you very much.